but I like to focus or draw your attention to two different events. One which we trace back to the early 16th century, and the other which is of course much more discussed, which is in the early 19th century. The first with the entry of the Europeans, a major change that happened in the Indian Ocean trade is in the culture of trade. Uh, Prior to the entry of Europeans, you find, and historically, the Indian Ocean trade is in a sense unique, or has its own character, because there are four major powers which are actually using these waters for trade: the Chinese, the Indian subcontinent, again various dynasties there, the Persians, the Arabs, and there is no evidence in terms of trade being militarized or trade happening accompanied by naval forces prior to the 16th century. Now this is something that was already happening by that time in the Mediterranean Ocean, because of the early, right from the time of the Crusades, which was also a way of capturing trading routes, establishing their monopoly on trading routes. That culture was already there amongst both the Europeans as well as the Arab traders in the Mediterranean Ocean. But you don't find that in a very prominent way in the Indian Ocean. Now, with the entry of the Europeans, of course, that changed, particularly the Portuguese. And I'll just like to kind of read out a very small passage from Ashin Das Gupta's work on Malabar and the Asian trade, Malabar in Asian trade. He writes that the Portuguese were important not because they were violent, although they certainly were, but because they were original. They brought with them a new kind of trading which was substantially different from the Asian trade. Both, of course, were still medieval, and the newness which was Portuguese could not alter the systems of production and distribution prevalent in Asia. Still, the important difference is that the Arab merchants of Calicut were convinced that the Portuguese were not traders, but they were pirates. Their apprehension, by and large, came true. The Portuguese gradually elaborated a complex system of compulsion. So there's a compulsion in trade which kind of emerges with the incursion of the Portuguese, which eventually, if you see, Professor Kadam was referring to not only the English East India Company, but all the East India companies, which is a system of monopoly chartered companies controlling trade. Now that system then eventually kind of becomes or gives the characteristic of monopoly trade in the Indian Ocean, which eventually the English East India Company is monopolizing all trade, at least for the British Indian territories in the Indian Ocean. More in the eastern side, a little later in the western side. Now, coming to the second, or fast forwarding 3 centuries into the beginning of the 19th century, the beginning of the first half of the 19th century, again widely noted by historians, is the century where India is losing its advantage in world trade, primarily because of the loss of the market for manufactured goods, handicrafts, cotton handicrafts primarily, which is seeing a precipitous decline in this by around 1840. Often the mainstream economic history or historian discourse has kind of focused on technological obsolescence, that you could not compete with the machine-made goods. But when we look at some evidence, we find that may not be entirely true. But there might be other reasons why it really kind of declined. Of course, today if you kind of compare handicrafts with machine-made goods, machine-made goods are manufactured at a much cheaper cost. In an inquiry by the House of Commons in 1813, which was mainly about whether to extend the charter of the English East India Company further, but they were also trying to find out whether there would be a market for machine-made goods in India. The English machine-made goods. It is revealed that there is a major disparity in terms of import duties. In England, they are on calicos, the import duty was somewhere between 70 to 80%, depending on the surcharges that are levied. On muslins, it is close to 80%. Colored cloths are prohibited. Whereas in India, on machine-made manufactured goods, the import duties are between the customs duties are 2.5 to 3.5%. So practically, it's free trade. Now, this kind of a distorted free trade was at the center of the decline of India Indian goods not entering the English markets. But the story doesn't stop there. I think there is also a role of the particular kind of monopoly trade that emerged in the Indian Ocean, particularly with the, spearheaded by the East India Company, English East India Company, which had a monopoly over, which was basically had a monopoly over purchase of cotton cloth, which then was being diverted systematically out of the world markets. There is some evidence that has emerged which shows that the English East India Company, because it cannot take the goods inside England, is largely re-exporting the goods and re-exporting the goods largely to the New World, to the Americas, where the Indian goods are being used for payments to slaves, or the modern slavery that has emerged, which meant that the Indian goods were, in a sense, through the monopoly system of trade, also systematically kind of removed from the markets, which of course the English industries, textile industries captured in a very dramatic and rapid fashion. The British historian H. Wilson actually says that the British had to kind of impose these import duties of 70 to 80%, because without those the mills of Manchester and Lancashire and Paisley would not have kind of run again, even with the power of steam. So he kind of identifies it in Mill's history of British India, that it is not so much about technological obsolescence, but more about the system of import duties, restriction of trade, but also the system of monopoly trade which came to dominate the Indian Ocean, which eventually kind of led to this kind of a colonial subjugation, where India loses out its share in the world trade because it loses out on exporting value added products and becomes a specializer in more of primary products, food products.